Kept going. I didn't even pick on her. I probably could've.
Yeah.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about categorical data and summarizing categorical data. So we spent a couple days. So the first week we kind of talked about the scientific process and where some statistics and probability fits in that, kind of the general ideas. A few ideas about surveys and experiments, about where biases can come in, and a few things how they should be designed. But we transitioned pretty quickly here into summarizing some sample data. So once you've done your survey or experiment or gather data somehow from the web or some other source, and you have some numbers, right, what type of summaries do we do? And today we're going to talk about primarily the categorical data and describing those. So, but the data that we get are either going to be quantitative, generally, and so the quantitative variables you would have they are numerical, are recordings of numerical measurements of one sort or another. The quantitative variables, it makes sense to take averages or add them up. They're on some absolute scale where it makes sense to compare numbers and distances between numbers. So for these type of numbers, it makes sense to add them, to average them, maybe take differences between two numbers, and that's a meaningful quantity up there. Sometimes we will scale things, like change from Fahrenheit to Celsius, or some other measurement scale. You know, prime examples like this that you'd have it in a study would be things like dollars or time, right? Or size measurements like length or area, like, or volume. Those type of things. Other scientific measurements could be concentrations, speeds, things like that. Measurements of speed, measurements of concentrations, maybe measurements of force one way or the other. So many different scientific measurements would be quantitative, and the idea is that from the distance from going from one level of force to another level of force is a meaningful thing, and it's absolute. It's the same for everybody. And we'll look at more of the quantitative variables and doing things with quantitative variables really on Wednesday and Friday. Mean, median, standard deviations, and calculations like that. And today we're really looking more at the qualitative ones. And the qualitative ones really, sometimes they're called categorical. And they really record membership in a group or some type of category. Group or category. You can have 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, any number of those. Often the qualitative variables are entered into the computer for storage by putting a number, a code in there. But it doesn't really make sense to take differences between codes or take the average of things quite the same way. You don't really average the code to get a meaningful number. Sometimes people do that, but not every time. Yes?
All right, so on the homework,
Yes.
when you have the quantitative and then like in the parentheses categorical, you're talking about the same thing, right?
Yeah, so qualitative sometimes people use the same one word for the other. Like they're qualitative, they're describing the qualities of something rather than an absolute numerical value. We can look at some examples like that, right? So for instance, say you wanted to look at sound volume. You might record sound volume if you're looking at birds, or if you're doing some noise pollution, or sound that's produced by an engine or something, or recording music, right? How do we want to record? So we have some song or something that we're recording. How do we want to represent that as data? Right? Sometimes things might be possible to represent it either as categorical or as quantitative numerical values. Right? If we wanted to, any suggestions? So if you're comparing different things, right? We might a qualitative one you might just call it high, medium, and low, and based on somebody's impression, how did that sound to you? They could report one of those levels, right? But somebody's high might be different from somebody else's medium, but those would record different levels. Yes.
So that would this would be sound volume in regard to people's opinion of it, as opposed to actual measures of the decibels.
Yeah. So a qualitative version, right? You could record high, medium, and low. But if you had an instrument that would actually record decibels, right, on an appropriate thing, that would be more of a quantitative, numerical value. Right? So you have an average. You could average decibels. You're not really going to average high, medium, or low. You're going to report things like that. Yes.
All right, just to be clear with this, like I absolutely understand like that decibels is something that would be quantitative versus qualitative, high, medium, low.
Yeah.
But if you define like high as being like 100 decibels, medium being 80 decibels, and low being 30 decibels, would that be then a qualitative measurement because there are numbers associated with it, or would it be qualitative because that's still just high, medium, low?
So it would still be qualitative because you still can't average high, medium, and low, but obviously they're very closely related, right? That would be more objective for categorizing that. I guess that's the word, for like category, right? So it's taking you can take a quantitative measure, often you cut it into different levels. So you're at age. Well, you might report age in years, and of course you can take averages of ages, difference of ages, and that's numerical, right? But often we define things in terms of levels of age, right? 18 to 35, 35 to 64, 64 and above, and you would get then the categories. But you wouldn't want to really take these as 1, 2, 3, and take an average of those and say that's my average is a 2.5, whatever that would mean. If you actually have the original measurements as a scientific value, then you could do both. And sometimes for some statistical analyses, it's easier to use the quantitative variables, but sometimes for reporting or in other applications, categorizing is sufficient. Right. So the other things don't work out so well to have a numerical value behind them. So something like a rating scale, right? Asking somebody a question, what do you think that St. Michael's has done? Should have canceled the morning classes, or should they have had those? Do you strongly agree? Are you kind of neutral about it? Disagree, or strongly disagree? Right? Would be a rating scale, right? that you would have, right? Maybe you would put numbers on these, like 5, 4, 3, 2, 2, and 1. Even if they have numbers, it doesn't mean that you would really take an average of them, because the difference between neutral and agree is not 1 unit of anything. It's not 1 second or 1 point or something like that. It's just a different category. These are ordered, but it would be better to just report the percentage of students that said one of these things if they're going to ask anybody about that. But there's many other examples of qualitative groups that end up in studies. Right? Other qualitative groups Gender, right, usually is recorded as female and male. As with any question, some people might say, don't know or refused, or that's something that you can always get as a response, even if it's a numerical value, like actually recording the quantitative value of the decibels. Every once in a while, the recording material will fail, right? Or there'll be a disturbance or an outside noise. A fire truck will be going by and disturb the process, and you'll decide, well, we don't really know what it was. It wasn't a good measurement. And so you don't know, or it's missing. Same thing here. Typically, it's recorded as two levels. Yes and no. If it's 2 levels, it can also be called a binary variable. It's another word for it is called dichotomous. Right? The dichotomy between one category and the other. Any question that you might answer as yes or no, right? Is a qualitative one, yes, agree, or no. It might be, some things might be your opinion. Do you agree with this? Have you done such and such? Have you had a medical exam in the last year? Did you get a flu shot? Right? Those are yes and no. But other demographics, right? Anything else? Right, think about other categories. Right? You're talking about people, race, ethnicity. Can be recorded in different ways. Studies years and years ago typically focused on just a few race, ethnicity categories, and often didn't let people classify themselves and choose their own. The government standard now includes a large array of choices, with people generally being able to choose their own categories, including multiple categories. So actually recording or summarizing something that becomes very diverse and with many, many possibilities is a bit of a challenge, but still it's categorical. If you're doing experiments, the levels of the treatment assigned to somebody, right, could be categorical, right? You could do a high, medium, or low dose, or you can get treatment with a placebo, right? If it's a drug or something that has a numerical value, it might have a numerical value behind it, but essentially it might represent high and low. So if it's described as a category or a group or something that is not a quantitative measurement, it could be one of these. Right? Another neat one, I think, is genetics. If there's say A versus little a, at each genetic locus, if there's alternatives for what type of gene is there, what expression of that allele is there, right? They sometimes can come in pairs, and an individual could have a large version of this, maybe that's the dominant version of it, and then one heterozygous would be a mix of those, or they could have the 2 recessive genes. Not all genes operate that way, but as an example, they could have those levels, and which category they have, would be categories, right? Classification, right? Sometimes genetics, the presence or absence of different genes, leads to a measurement of something like protein levels, right? So that they or gene arrays. There's things where they have light and fluorescence and measure the quantity of the gene or things like that. So there might be a numerical measurement that could be possible with this, but just calling it the categories gives it these. So really, this it applies to a lot of different situations. Right? In these, and in any one particular real study, you might have many different categorical, qualitative variables. Some of them might be tied or related to other quantitative things, but others are just going to be purely defining groups that you're interested in for data. So what do we do with these categories, right? Describing categorical responses has only a few varieties that we usually do. We can give the counts of responses in each category. How many people in your sample are in each level. Right? You can convert those to percentages or decimals, depending on how you want to display it. What fraction of the sample is in each category? What fraction of the population has large A, what fraction is heterozygous, what section is both of those, right? But more interestingly, when you do this, there's some graphs. There's a few graphs that can be done to try and depict those, different type of bar graphs or things like that. Pie graphs maybe, but those are a little bit hard to read actually. But more importantly is once you have one of these variables, is you can think about it in relationship to the others, right? I think that's what's really interesting. Is how do things change from one categorical variable or one qualitative variable as you look at other subgroups, right? So we want to look at the relation to other variables. All right, so let's look at we have a handout. Does everybody have a copy of the handout? It does, right? And so these are a series of examples, right, where we're going to just talk through some of the things that are in there. If I make this big, right, then I'll go over here and use this to move it along. It's a little easier to read, right? So, one example, right? So, there's a little data set included in a book we use in Statistics 120 typically that has data on 25 different apartments in Minneapolis, right, that were sold during a certain period of time. Right, and one variable they have on that is a rating variable. Right? Somehow they have a rating that is excellent, good, or fair. You could have poor, but this particular data set didn't have any really bad apartments that were sold during that time. Right? And so 6 of them were excellent, 14 were good, and 5 were fair. Right? So there's 25 apartments in all. You can report that in a table. Right? As a percent, right? Yeah, I mean you can judge, 6, 14, 5. Well, relatively, kind of what categories are more likely. Fair, good's the most likely. Excellent and fair are about the same, but it's often useful just to turn it into percentages. Right? So. Out of the 25, of these, 24% of them are excellent, 56% are good, and 20% are fair. Right? So if you're summarizing that for somebody who's looking at these data, you would actually have a sentence that would say those things. Either counts or maybe counts with percentages, so people get a clear picture of the distribution. Right? For these apartments, if you were selling apartments or buying apartments, what are some other variables you might want to think about recording? Yes.
This might be due more to location of where the apartment is,
Yeah. Okay.
versus the
Back to my, sorry, I'm just getting.
versus the apartment itself, maybe distance to local schools
Yeah. And distance to school?
or other commodities,
Yeah, distance to school, supermarkets,
restaurants.
Metro if you're in a large city. The distance to the metro, if you're walking distance to a metro makes a big difference in the price, yeah. So how would you describe those? Would those be qualitative or quantitative?
Those, I always mess up saying, I think they would be categorical, they would be describing, so qualitative, right?
So I went to the distance.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
that would be quantitative.
There's a quantity, we can average those quantities, we could you can call them also numerical or qualitative.
Well, what I was also thinking was if you were to categorize them as far, medium far, and not so
Yeah.
far.
Yeah, any of those
or-
distance, yeah. So that would be, if you, close.
There we go, that's the word I was looking for.
Medium or far, right, you could classify that, and then maybe that would be easier to display. than the actual number. You could say, choose all those that are close, and then the person doesn't have to, make up their own criteria. Well, how far is close? Yeah, so, yes.
So, if you wanted to say like how many bedrooms and how many bathrooms, would that be, so that would be qualitative because it's categorical? So
Yeah,
you'd
so-
say like this is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, house or
Right.
something?
So with
or would
that,
be-
there gets a little bit of fuzziness for these things that are counts, right?
Yeah.
So if you're, the number of, say bedrooms that it has, or the number of rooms, right? Those are numbers, right? So you could add those up. If you took 2 apartments, and this had 5, and this had 7, you could add them together and say there's 12 rooms altogether. So if you have that count, right, that's actually a numerical value. You could say what's the average number of rooms, average number of baths. But if there's a small number of levels, 0, 1, 2, 3, kind of a small number of levels, it would be very easy to report it as just the number that have 1 bathroom, the number that have 1.5 bathrooms, the number that have 2, and so on. But it's something that you could actually average together, so.
So that would be quantitative.
Yeah, so if you had, say, the number of rooms, the number of bedrooms, et cetera, this again is quantitative, right? Because you can take the differences, this one has 5 more than that one, and that makes sense, right? But you could convert it to houses, apartments that are large, medium, and small. And you could put maybe a very large or a studio apartment as very small. You don't necessarily have to have 3 levels. So you might take that quantitative value and make cut points, and then it's just giving you the categories. And instead of having people need to think about, you might want to have the actual numerical value. If it has 3 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, that's different than having 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. There's kind of, you might want to know those actual numbers, but they might both be classified as large. Okay, so. In this handout, right, so, right, some ones that would be either or, like does it have a parking space or not? Is it on the ground floor? Is it on the top floor? Right, there could be, does it have a view of the lake? Right, kind of these yes/no questions that would describe it would all fall into that categorical thing. It either does or doesn't have that property. If you had one way to relate these things, so if you had something like sales price, you could look at average sales price or median sales price, and we'll go over the different calculations of those things on Wednesday and Friday. But you certainly could look at those quantitative things separated by those categorical variables, right, to see if there's much of a pattern, right? And so the qualitative categorical ones that's one of their key uses, right? So dividing up the sample and looking for differences, which could be in terms of right, a quantitative variable, right? Good. So a second, yes.
But this is a little slightly off topic, but it does have to do with the homework questions.
Okay.
So, would this be an example of an enumerable study versus a qualitative study? Would this be an enumerable one because things are fixed?
So, in terms of this, so if they have the 25 apartments that are sold in a certain period of time, right, so we can be describing those 25. So then what might be the 25 that are sold in this region of neighborhoods in a certain month, right? And so it's not really a separate population that you're thinking about, right? That's that clear. Often we tell stories, but these 25 are typical of the ones that we would think would be selling in this area, right? So it's not exactly a random pick sample, but it might suggest something about the housing stock that we would think would become available, right? Is this going to be similar to the next month? Is it similar to last month? Right? You could compare to see if there's trends and changes, but maybe there's about a quarter, maybe about half. This is not too far from a quarter, so maybe about 1/4 fair, about half of them in the good, and then a quarter about really excellent. that might suggest things about the population of housing stock out there.
So like if this was like totally randomly generated for this, like these 25 apartments, it would, and your goal was to figure out what the condition of the apartments are in the city, for instance.
Yeah.
That would be an enumerable study then?
So, right, so, yeah, so if you're thinking about, so I use the language that most resonates, is are you just describing the sample? Right? Or you're trying to do inference and you're trying to generalize to the entire population, right? And that doesn't, so the key is that we don't know exactly how these were generated and why these are here. If these are the 25 sales that happened in 1 month period, in a row, it's not really a random sample, and you have to have a little more belief that that is typical of what you're going to see in the future, right? Just to try and generalize. There are surveys that that look at apartments. One very large one is New York City does a housing vacancy survey that looks at housing conditions, and there they survey 10,000 or more different households and go to those apartments and try to assess quality and things like that. So this is a very small sample. In the New York City one, that sample is supposed to give them information about the entire population, right? They try to estimate what the housing stock is like, and is it getting better, getting worse, how much is available, what are prices, and things like that.
So, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
just trying to make sure this is clear, just because it is due Wednesday. That's
Okay.
the only reason
Sure.
I'm bringing this up, or
Yeah.
otherwise I'd just
Okay.
ask
Yeah.
about it otherwise. So a enumerable study is one that you only focus on the sample that you're looking at, or differences within that sample. Well, a quantitative study, you're trying to take that sample to project out towards a bigger population of something you don't know.
Yeah, I'll have to check how the book, just describes it. But if you focus on, is it describing these 25 just for the purposes of describing these 25, right? Versus thinking these 25 are similar to what we would find if we look at another larger population.
Okay.
Yeah, so trying to focus on those.
Yeah, I read the book description, I wasn't sure, so I was just wondering.
Yeah, and that enumerable versus, inferential, and different authors will use slightly different terms. But the key is it these 25 that you're only focusing on, or are we looking to a kind of a broader group? I think if I turn that one off, it's a little bit less clear. So here's a second example. This is from another textbook by Dick DeVoe at Williams and Bellman at Cornell, where they had 626 people in a medical study, reported in an article, who either had hepatitis C or not. Right? Hepatitis C is an infectious disease. If left untreated, it can do damage to the liver and can be fatal. It's spread a number of ways. It can be sexually transmitted. It also can be transmitted through needles and blood. Right? So in this study, about 7.5% of the individuals had hepatitis C and the others didn't. Right? So what is related to people having this? Right? So the other variable they had, did people have tattoos in the sample? I don't know if they did a full examination of them or just asked, do you have any tattoos or not? And the question is based on, and here's the two-way table, right, because it's two variables. 22 people had no tattoos and had hepatitis C. Right, they had both. 491 people, the category that's most common is they did not have hepatitis C and they had no tattoos. 491 out of the 626. Right? And so on. Right? Across this row, the 22 and 591 give us the 513 total, or you can look down this way. Right? And so then the question is, are these variables associated with one another? Does it look like hepatitis C is related somehow to having tattoos from these data? So just with the counts, just by looking at the counts, can you kind of think about it some way to try and assess whether it's associated? Right? Yes.
Well, you can see that the this definitely wouldn't be the clearest way of showing an association, because it's really kind of oh, there's a number of them. Well, especially since you have percentages and just regular counts. But if you're just looking at it, it looks like it is, because you have almost, I would guesstimate about 90% of the people with Hep C also have tattoos, versus only about probably, again guesstimating, like maybe a
So
less
if they
than a
have,
fourth.
if they have Hep C, right, 22 out of 47 don't
Oh,
have
yeah, sorry.
tattoos, 25 out of 57.
So about-
About half,
Around
maybe, or
half.
something like that, right? But it's really a lot less right there, right? So we will look at different percentages. And once you have a two-way table, you can look at the percentage in any one cell, like 22 out of 626, or you can look at the rows or the columns. So here's some percentages done different ways, right? So depending on the question, you're going to calculate things overall, right? So this is the percent that are in each one, and these four add up to 100%. 3.5% of the individuals had no tattoos and hepatitis C, right? Or you could look at one of the rows, right? Out of this row, right? If we just look at that row here, there's 513 individuals. 22 out of 513 had hepatitis C. So among those with no tattoos, if I'm saying what percent of those individuals with no tattoos had hepatitis C, right? Then it's just 22 out of 513. However, for the group that had tattoos, 25 out of 113 for them. So that's going to be a much different rate. So in this row, it's only 4.5% or 4.3% for hepatitis C. But among the tattoo group, it was 22.1. Right? So looking that direction. Somebody might ask another question, right? Of those who have hepatitis C, what percent have tattoos? Right? Then you're going to calculate the fraction going down that column. So it's all situational, right? Depending on what question you're asking. Are you looking at the rows or the columns or just the percentage that is classified by both, right? Yeah.
Because the percentage of the participants who have Hep C is so low, wouldn't it be a little bit like troublesome, maybe that might not be the right word, to say, oh, tattoos are associated with Hep C because the population with Hep C actually is so small?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about generalizing to a broader population, people that are similar to the adults that are represented in this, right? That if the sample size, the overall sample size was this, 626. So we will talk about standard errors, right? That we see a difference in these rates, right? And the difference of the rates, say, comparing no tattoos versus tattoos, it's 4% versus 22%. So it's an 18% difference there. If that's only based on a very small sample size, it might be, the sample difference is 18%, but it might not give us really good information about what the population might be, right? A population that's nearly equal might produce that, but I think in this case it would end up being actually imbalanced enough that we would judge it would be significant. So when we get into inference and some tests for tables, we'll get a quantitative assessment. Is this surprising? Right? Is this big of a difference? Would that be surprising if these two groups really were the same in the population? Right? And so we will answer that question. And small sample sizes can make things that even appear to be a big difference, we would not think that that it was that great of evidence. Right? You have to have sufficient sample size, and we'll get formulas for that. So yeah, so in this case, it does appear that that's associated. Right? If you had more information, right? Do people get tattoos? Some of them got them in a tattoo parlor, where a lot of people are going, and they have their equipment, and they're supposed to sanitize it, and they reuse it, right? Other ways of getting tattoos, people give them to themselves, they give them to their friends. Outside of that, right? It's possible. And these are the data. Now, numbers are getting smaller, so we'd be a little bit concerned about inference for the population. Maybe there's a lot of variability in the sample just because it's a small sample size. Right? But if you calculate the rates of hepatitis C by row here, it's highest in the tattoo parlors. Right? Now, this could be dated, but this type of information, right? What would you do if you were working in public health and had this information? Yeah.
You'd make stricter regulations on tattoo parlor hygiene.
Yeah, so if there was something that they could do in terms of sanitizing and really being clean, maybe you could make those numbers go down, right?
Especially since it looks like granted, again, the numbers are small, so like you can't really necessarily make this inference, but if you're to publish this, a lot of people would be like, oh, I have a 1 in 3 chance of getting Hep C from that by getting a tattoo.
Yeah, so, and some of this is historic, so things could have, changed, by now, but it's a bigger risk, so they're probably more reputable tattoo parlors and ones that are a little bit more kind of under the radar or something and so, it's information that could be useful to you, so we learned something from that. So.
Making me wonder about getting a tattoo.
Yeah, well, right. So here's another little data set, right? There's surveys called a general social survey that asks people in the United States about a number of things, and this was asking individuals who are finishing high school what they plan to do. The survey was done in 1980 to 1990 and 2000. And the responses people could give were they'd go to college, they'd get some employment, they'd join the military, or they'd travel or do something else. Right? I think travel was kind of more of a catch-all combination thing there, right? And do you notice any patterns between these over time? Yes?
Non-college options go down in terms of the number of...
The college options?
The non-college.
The non-college options are going down, right? Yeah. So they are going down, right? Pretty much, or the travel has gone down in these 2 years, right? Are you sure? Go ahead.
Just to say, the total amount of samples is drastically different from year to year.
Yeah, there's a little bit difference in the sample sizes. Your impression is right. I mean, it is going down, right? But because of that changing sample size, right? Changing from these counts to proportions can make things pretty clear, right? So if you take percentages, so in 1980, add those up, divide all of these numbers in 1980 by the total, which looks like about 450 or so, right? You get 71% going to college, 22% going to employment, and 4% for each of those. As you go forward, right, the military and travel ones have not changed all that much. I mean, military went up for a little while, right? But the college versus employment really has changed, right? The plans. Now, whether everybody actually does that, according to their plans is another thing. But by going to by percentages, you can see pretty clearly some pattern that's going on there. Right? Now, the next couple examples present a situation where simply looking at the proportions as they are doesn't tell the whole story, right? So this is a classic example from 1973 that at UC Berkeley admissions, there were 8,400 some men that applied to graduate school, and about 4,321 women that applied to graduate school. So now this was 1973. Rates of application are much more equal across the board, and in some fields certainly higher for women. Within statistics and biostatistics graduate programs, the majority of graduate students in biostatistics has been women for a number of years. And in statistics, it's pretty close as well. Right? But at this time, of these men, 44% of them were admitted. Right? So 44% of the 8,000 some were admitted to graduate school. Among the women, the admission rate was 35%. Right? So on the face of it, does it look like things are equal? Right? On the face of it, right, it looks like one group is favored for the other, right? Over the other. Right? The data are also available by different departments. Right? These could be a different, anthropology, biology, computer science, math, English, business. These are different departments. They're not necessarily tied to the letters, but that's how it was reported in the study. So if you break it out by department, so the department that they're in is another categorical variable. Right? So we have men and women as one variable, right? Admitted and not admitted as another variable. And if you throw in this third one of department, the counts changed. So of 825 men applied to Department A, and 62% of them were admitted. 108 women applied to that department, and 82% of them were admitted. So with the results by each department, does there appear to be a gender bias or a difference? How has the story changed by including this other factor? Yes.
You get to see more, not specialized results, but you get to see how like it's more of an average of percentages instead of not just the plain percentages.
Yeah.
Because
Right, so the percentage admit is not the same in every department.
no,
Yeah,
it's not. Like you could like argue that maybe Department A is a smaller department than Department B is, and maybe more women were applying to, or maybe more women were applying to fewer departments. And if that was the case, it would make sense why the number of admittance was smaller, was because if you have more applicants to something, your percentage of admittance is going to go down. Well, no, not necessarily, but like,
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
There's some differences, yeah, yes.
I was just gonna ask if that's an example of stratification.
It's kind of like stratification, yeah, splitting it by this other group, we're essentially stratifying the results, or in experiments it's blocking, but just subdividing on that categorical variable. It's like stratifying. Instead of just taking a simple random sample overall, it's getting now these are the population levels, so everybody that's applied, so it's not really a sample, but it is breaking it very, very much the same way, right? Yeah. And there's differences, yes.
It's also interesting because when you look at this breakdown, you can see that some departments had way more people, admitted. Like if you look at Department F down there, it's only 6% of 370 and then 7% of 340 as opposed to Department A, which is 62% of 825 and 82% of 100. So just the number of people that went into the different departments is staggeringly different, which is something which
Yeah. So that's
shouldn't be
excellent.
discounted,
Seeing the difference of these things is exactly the point. Is that some departments are much larger and some are smaller. Some have high admission rates and some have low admission rates. And where men and women apply is not equal. Right? There seems to be some choices that women are making and men are making back in 1973 about what type of graduate study they're going to. So in Department A, men are really likely to apply there and women much less so. Department F, the number of applicants is much more balanced. And Department E is more women are applying than men, right? And you can look at differences in the different department rates. There are some differences, and you could maybe wonder why are those particularly different for some. But kind of this combination mix of the different sizes, men and women applying at different rates to different departments, and departments having different admission rates, high versus low, produces an effect. And when you roll it up and simplify it as just admit versus don't admit, the women end up with a lower rate. Now, this is not saying it's fair, how it's gone, right? But it's a little more nuanced story about what's happening.
Isn't this why the gender pay gap is such a controversial concept? Because if you, I know that if you break it up by department, it seems like women are favoring lesser paying jobs. And by looking at it that way, it's arguable it disappears depending on who you talk to with the statistics.
Yeah, it's a subtle thing. I mean, any of these employment discrimination cases, right? Somebody's paid a certain amount, and they say, I'm not being paid fairly, because there's other people who are doing the same job or the same qualifications, and they're paid more to do the same things. Some of it depends on, are you looking at, what are you aggregating, and what do you adjust for, right? If you say, oh, well, that person gets a little bit more because they did this and this and this, they have one more qualification, they have one more service opportunity, and so on, or this is their specialty is a little more, selective. You can really go down this list and become, so how much is enough for adjusting for? So the studies are hard to do, in part because, well, in academic ones, it is hard to fully quantify contributions of somebody's and their qualifications. Some people will spend more time teaching and with students and doing more service, and others will go for the high impact publications and spend more time doing that. So which one do you pay more? Right. Some people get higher salaries because they ask for it more. That they'll go to other places and get more job offers, and they're more inclined to say, oh, such and such place asked me to apply for a job, maybe you should increase my salary. And other people won't kind of promote themselves the same way. And so it's tough to say, now certainly there are cases where you quantify the essential characteristics and there appears to be a bias. But the arguments they make in those cases are of this type. It's like, oh, well, no, if you break it out by this, it looks like things are still equal. And sometimes that's a legitimate thing to break it out by, and sometimes it's kind of artificial. Maybe that shouldn't be part of the job and shouldn't be a justification for a different pay, and you just searched and found something that kind of makes it work out for you. But in any case. So this is something called Simpson's paradox. There was a mathematician, statistician in the 1950s called Simpson, E.L. Simpson, who wrote an article kind of describing this phenomenon that by conditioning or splitting data by another variable, you can have apparent relationships that can be erased or even reversed. And it doesn't need to be a question, that's a typo. So it happens, right? So a lurking variable is a variable, it might be called a confounding variable. It's another variable that you don't necessarily know about that could be impacting the relationship between the two variables, right? And it has to have some of the characteristics like that department example. There have to be differences between the groups. If males and females applied to departments exactly the same percentages, right, it couldn't reverse it. Or if they got the same admission rates in every department by department, then it wouldn't happen as well. But there's a difference in admission rate, of application rates, and then there's some difference in admission rates. So those key things you were commenting on is necessary for it to return. But this is an interesting thing, I think, an important thing is then when you're looking at variables, is thinking about other variables that might modify the relationship in a reasonable way. Right? So one more example of this. So here's information on a couple hospitals, Hospital A and Hospital B, and say this is a fairly common procedure that they're doing, but with some risk, appendix surgery or some other surgery, and there's some risk of dying. In Hospital B, 2% of the patients, or 16 out of 800, died as part of that. But at the 2,100 who went to Hospital A, only 3% died. So, which hospital is better? Which one would you rather go to?
Hospital A.
Yeah. Hospital A? Why would you want to go to A?
Because it's, I would assume that it's a more desired hospital because of the total numbers.
Because it's bigger, but their rate of death is higher, right? 3% is bigger than 2%, so it looks worse, right? But maybe, yes.
But on the other hand, like 63 people out of 2,100 is not bad. It is, 16 out of 800. Like this actually might be falling into one of the biases that people have, but like it looks worse.
Maybe, yeah. So, but I mean, the 3%. If you take the 63 out of 2,100, you get 3%, and 16 out of that. So adjusting for the sample size, the Hospital A has a higher percentage. But maybe there's something there. Why does Hospital A have more? Does that mean anything?
Would it have something to do with, a question that I would ask is, does Hospital B have the same capabilities that Hospital A has?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's
that's kind of the idea, if we kind of go, I can go to the next one here, right? So that's this example, there's the next line, right? So, maybe people come in before the surgery, and some people have a very poor condition, and so they have a poor prognosis wherever they go, and then other people come in and it's more mild. So they don't have other complications there. You have to do appendix surgery, and otherwise you're healthy and robust and don't have health concerns, you're probably in a better condition to have that. But if somebody comes in and they're immune compromised, or they're elderly, or they have heart disease or something, and then you do surgery on them, right, they're less likely to fare so well. So if you knew the patients that came in good condition and poor condition and split out like this, right, you can have these data, and if you aggregate it just as survival versus not by hospital, right, you can add it back together and get to these. Right? in this case, hospital A, 600 patients come in good condition, and there's 1,500 who are in poor condition. Right? Hospital B, 600 are in good condition and 200 are in the poor condition. So which hospital is treating more of the sick patients? The ones that are in worse condition.
Hospital B.
So here, hospital A, right, is getting 1,500 versus 200 versus 600, 600. So it looks like hospital A gets more of the people coming in the poor condition, right? The survival rate among those people is 3.8% in hospital A, but it's 4% in B. So hospital A seems to be doing a better job for those patients. How about the ones that are in the good condition? 50, they're both getting 600, right? But there's slightly more deaths in hospital B, right? Hospital A is doing a little bit better. There's not all that big of numerical numbers between that, but the idea is that hospital A is doing better for everybody, no matter what condition you are, right? But their patient case mix, right, starts out worse. They're the hospital that gets more of the worst cases, right? So research hospitals, that have the most specialized units often have the longest length of stays. They have mortality rates that are higher because they're getting all the burn units. They're getting the terminal cancers. They're getting the really severe operations, the lung transplants and things like that. You're not going to do that in a little suburban hospital. Right? You're going to do that in the big ones. And so many of their statistics, if you didn't adjust for that, could make them look worse. But it could be the best hospital on the planet. It's just taking the sickest patients. Right, so in U.S. News and World Report and other things that rank hospitals, they call it adjusting to the patient case mix. What are the typical patients that are coming there? Right? And that you want to equalize things so that if you're a hospital in Florida that's getting a bunch of elderly patients more than your share, or you're doing whatever your population is. If the population, unfortunately, with poverty often is associated bad diets. Cheap food, lower education, associated with more smoking and things like that. So if your population that your hospital's serving has that patient case mix, it's harder to keep everybody healthy and deal with it. And so Simpson's paradox kind of points to that you want to adjust for these other factors. Look at other things that might be related to try and help explain. And there's a lot of different categorical variables we can use to do that. But putting into words, how this trade-off happens, right, is a bit, takes a little bit of care to think about writing about this. Right? Because it's not just that the rates of survival are different at the two places, right? It often takes a couple sentences because the hospitals have to have a different patient case mix, and within each of those different, the good condition and the poor condition, there's a different survival rates, right? If the survival rate didn't depend on that, we wouldn't see that reversal, right? Everything would just be kind of aggregated up. But because there's this extra difference in there, the proportions, you get more of an effect. So, but any questions about? So there's a couple of questions on the homework for describing, rows or columns, changing things to percentages or back, and answering some questions like that. So not much more detailed than what we've done here, and sometimes you have to read into the question and hypothesize about some differences. The other things that are there is these things get used a lot, right? So this is not DPP, it's supposed to be that. It's supposed to be a study called a meta-analysis that I've been involved in. I'm still kind of continuing to evolve in, but we brought together a bunch of different studies together, and it's a treatment for a disease called bacterial vaginosis that affects women in pregnancy and can be associated with preterm births. And so one thing that we reported are the characteristics of the women that were in these different studies once we aggregated them together. So we're going to report the number of twin pregnancies that are in the treatment or the placebo groups. And it was pretty similar. The women had previous obstetrical history. Was this their first pregnancy? Have they had pregnancies before with no previous preterm births? Have they had pregnancies before with a preterm? Right, those are risk factors for future cases, or is that information missing? Self-reported smoking status. Some studies didn't ask or didn't report it in their data set, so we couldn't get at that. This is how they reported race, ethnicity in there. So we're looking at the percentages there. These little numbers over here are test statistics. We'll get p-values and things that we associated. And so the point of this table in this study, looking at some of these categorical qualitative variables, is to say how are the two groups, are they similar to one another? There's other quantitative ones, which we do, means, plus or minus a standard deviation, and some other things. We'll look more at those, but pretty much the two groups looked quite similar. So studies often report these things. If you go to different websites, we'll look at this one. It seems to work. Maybe I'll do this one, the PowerPoint. So you go to any government website, National Center for U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Center for Health Statistics, Census Bureau, Department of Treasury. They do reports on data, and this is one I just trends in agriculture. So it depicts things here. Many variables are reported on these different studies. So change in the number of farms as a percent. Is this going to be a qualitative variable or a quantitative variable?
Quantitative.
Yes, so it's actually the count of the number of farms, so it's a quantitative number, so we can get an actual number or convert it to its percentage, right? Other things like this, land area in farms and acres. Again, it's quantitative because acres, you can add them up, count them, right? That percentage of New England farms by code, right? So in this case, there's all these different categories of farms, right? So this is a qualitative variable that they report on with a lot of different levels, right, that are in there. And then, so you this is a kind of a little graphical picture of this qualitative variable. You can kind of see some of the changes over time. Cash receipts, that would be quantitative, but again, they're breaking out that quantitative variable by all these different categories. Right? Milk, greenhouse, nursery, fruit, vegetables, and so on. Income, split out by, so government payments versus sales, right? So there's a few different categories they're splitting it there by. There are some things that, so state, percent of total market agricultural sales from direct sales in New England. Here's Vermont. So these are quantitative ones. Eventually we get to some down here, other pictures, organic sales as percentage of all agricultural sales. Then it has this one, right? Percent of farms with organic sales in New England. So eventually down here, we get something that's completely qualitative, right? The states are qualitative, a category. And then the organic versus not is the category. Right? And 2002, 2007, two different censuses, right, of agriculture. And we see the change. So you see in this the uptick of the number of farms doing something in organic. Right? And in Vermont, there's a big increase. It's still only about 8% back in 2007, so a lot of farms are not doing that, but we see that increase. Percentage of farms with women principal owners. Right? State is a categorical variable. Is yes, no, is it a woman, female principal owner versus not? And so these things are very interesting to see in terms of trends. Anyway, if you keep looking through these, percentage of farms with agritourism. Right? So what is agritourism? Going someplace and eating there, sampling the cheeses, sampling the wine, wine or something like that. Picking your own berries. They would take people from part of that.
How is Rhode Island in there? We need that.
How is Rhode Island in there?
Yeah, what do they have for that tourism?
percent agricultural tourism. I don't know what product
Yeah.
it is. I mean, but they're close to, Providence is a big city, big area there. It's not far from Boston, so maybe, I don't know, the cranberry bogs or something that people go watch, or something along the coast. Who knows?
Like, you think Maine would be high for like the blueberries, and Vermont would be high for
Maple sugar
Yeah,
houses
maple
and things you
and
can go. So
breweries.
yeah. So anyway, there's a lot of stories that would be highlighted. There's a couple examples, other ones on there, but in any study, typically there can be hundreds of variables. Many of them will be this categorical things that you could record. Often there's a lot of choices in how you record things. And then when you start looking at relationships, what affects something else, it can be it can be a little more subtle, just a two-way table. There can be a little bit more story behind that. So on Wednesday and Friday, we'll look at more of the quantitative variables like mean, standard deviation, and measurements like that. Yes?
I thought this is, did you want that homework printed or?
Oh, so yeah, so homework, it's good to either write it out or print it, whatever you do. Yeah, you actually bring in the paper, and then I'll take that and I'll make notes on it and comments to respond. It's a little bit easier to me than, if occasionally you have to be away for something, and I can take things via the email or something like that. But so that works. But if you can print it out or do it by hand, that's easiest for getting some feedback. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I just kind of did something.
Okay. Might you be in the problem in the
Creates them via correctness.
Maybe, I just like, was like, I did that.
Right. Look back in the book. So I kind of put a couple kind of preamble questions
Yeah,
before
okay.
that. So we're going to answer D that was
Probably in the book, okay,
Yeah.
probably.
So actually a question with, question B actually, it asks that, the whole, it doesn't say what the purpose of the study is. Do you want us just to kind of infer what, that they're talking about, I'm guessing they're trying to figure out what is the most efficient combination of the, like, is that an
treatment
okay
factors, yeah. Yep.
inference or read-in to figure out what type
Yeah.
of what type of survey it is?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Said everyone went on to it for combination. Yeah. User 5 did
I missed my lab, or not from one of the labs, I just for my lab, because he's like, oh, if you have your computer, you should bring that.
So I'm not.
And it didn't cross your mind, but maybe I
One of the days
should
I
this
won't be
morning.
in class.
Here,
Post something.
it's on the office hours.
But
Yep.
I
So
be like,
I teach tomorrow from 10:15
Really?
till
Oh, wow.
11:50, so
Tell everyone you're just going to a party.
something that in the kind of early afternoon is part of that.
good,
Before that.
like,
I have no
So like,
class
you don't
tomorrow.
come ballet.
Okay.
I'll put
my
it right
office
on
in
it.
your summer, I
Okay.
have like the real classes.
And then we just kind of
That's
like,
okay.
They'll understand.
yeah, just make sure everything, because I don't know what, I think it's a big percentage on assignments, right? It's like a big percentage on.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
I just wanna make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good, yeah, yes.
Okay, so I heard from another grad school and I have another interview.
Oh, okay.
So Friday, February 1st, I'm going to be in Ohio.
She's lying, she's going to a party.
Okay, good, well, congratulations.
Thank
So,
you.
I have a question about how you grade the homework.
Uh-huh.
Is it for credit or for correctness?
So it's, I mean, I will see if it's correct, but in a few of these things, there's kind of more interpretation about some of those things, and then I'm mostly looking for a reasonable kind of answer. People can get different kind of variations on some of these things. Some of the things that are numerical, there'll be a numerical answer. I usually look at the formulas or what people are writing down, so, over the course of the semester, it's not unlikely for somebody to write the right numbers down and then have a calculator error or something, and the number's kind of off. So I try to understand what's
That
going
makes sense.
on.
And when are your office hours?
So
Written down somewhere, but-
I have some after this next class, So 2:45
Okay.
today. I also have some tomorrow,
Okay.
before.